And bringing things back home now, the full deregulation of the petroleum downstream has taken effect after the Petroleum Products Pricing Regulatory Agency, PPPRA, confirmed the development earlier in the week. And based on economic principles, this is expected to contribute to inflation rate, which is even projected to rise to 12.95%. However, we're yet to see the effect on transportation fares across major parts of the country. Well, joining us now to analyze the implications and economics of the deregulation is Channels TV data analyst Babajide Ogusonwo, who is right here in the studio. Good morning, Babajide. Thank you for coming on the program. So tell us, what was the biggest factor that influenced the federal government's decision to deregulate petrol prices?
I'd like to take that question maybe from a slightly different perspective, which is how much do you spend to fill your tank now? Maybe I should ask you that question.
No, you answer the question yourself.
I think because your husband buys the petrol.
I buy it myself, but answer the question.
But, you know, perhaps we'll look at that question, but we should also, I'll share some facts with you on how many Nigerian men and women own vehicles in Nigeria, and I think the answer will surprise you. But before I share that with you, I'd like to talk about what you had asked me, and that's what has been the biggest factor that has influenced this decision. Is it the rising debt, which you talked about, 31 trillion naira, Nigeria's total debt, or is it something else? Is it the falling revenue? But the evidence we have shows that the key word that has caused the change and the options that are available to the government right now is one thing, and that is reality. There's a new reality. And now, what is this reality? I'd like us to take a look at what has happened since this government came in the second quarter of 2015 and look at how our crude oil exports have moved. And that picture will allow us to understand what is going on. And from that evidence we have, in the second quarter of 2015 when the government came in that quarter we sold oil worth $10.1 billion. That seemed to be a lot. But even things got better. By the third quarter of 2018, Nigeria was selling $13.5 billion worth of oil as at the third quarter of 2018. The government has been in power for 21 quarters. The evidence from the National Bureau of Statistics about our crude oil exports in the second quarter of this year was that we sold only $4.4 billion worth of oil. Only $4.4 billion worth of oil in the second quarter of this year.
So what's responsible for the drop?
Now, that's been because of COVID. We've seen lower oil prices and we've seen lower oil volumes. In summary, the second quarter of 2020, where the country sold only $4.4 billion worth of oil, has been the lowest crude oil revenue since the government came in. And so what has happened is between 2015 to 2020, the government is now being faced with reality. And the reality is there is no more revenue to be able to spend on subsidies that aren't producing, that are not productive anymore. But here's why crude oil remains and the crude oil revenue is important. Crude oil, based on the evidence we have from the NBS, shows that crude oil still accounts for 71% of everything that we sold as at the second quarter of this year. We are waiting for the third quarter data, but based on what has happened, we are not going to likely see any significant difference between the crude oil volume sales and the crude oil value sales in the second quarter of this year and third quarter. So the key word about what has happened and why we're going for an open market for pricing of petroleum is because of reality. The reality is that crude oil, the amount of money we are making from our crude oil exports is now at an all-time low.
And we've been talking about diversification over the years, and we're still at this point now.
Now, diversification, we haven't been able to really, and that's one of the things, the challenges that we still face. Diversification into agric. The evidence shows that even though we sold 6 trillion naira worth of, when we're looking at naira, 6 trillion naira worth of goods in the second quarter of this year, only 2%, BC, only 2% was based on processed food and beverages. And so we're still exporting significantly. We're exporting crude oil, which is our major source of revenue. The second thing is that crude oil revenue has dipped and non-oil revenue is still yet to grow. So we still need to put in a lot of investments into our non-oil sector.
But having said that, now, is there any research to confirm that high-income earners actually benefit the most from petrol price subsidy?
Now, High-income earners, I don't know if I should classify you as an high-income earner, but here's the evidence we have. Today in Nigeria, we have 100 million adults. Now, you can probably hold that figure in one hand, 100 million adults. But the evidence from the Federal Road Safety Commission and the National Bureau of Statistics shows that even though we've got 100 million adults, there are only 5 million vehicles in Nigeria. 5 million private vehicles, to be specific. In other words, 95% of adult Nigerians do not own vehicles. And so there seems to be some evidence that it's the few private vehicle owners, the less than 5% of adult Nigerians, that are really getting the benefits of regulated price. They are getting the benefits of a subsidy. Now, does this mean that those that do not own private vehicles do not get any benefits? Yes, they do get benefits, but those that get the direct benefits by driving their private vehicles to the filling station, the evidence shows that only less than 5% of Nigerians, adult Nigerians, have their private vehicles. And so while the deregulation will affect everybody, perhaps those that have their private vehicles, those that go around with commercial transportation will also see rising prices. But perhaps I will also want to now take a look at the change in inflation, because that is the key challenge Nigerians are facing. Not really about the price, it's about the implications of the price adjustment. And the implications of the price adjustment, if we look at the inflation results over the last 21 quarters, month on month, we'll see that inflation yesterday in Nigeria is at 12%. But looking back at what had happened in 2017 when inflation rose to as high as 18%. So the government needs to focus on making sure that we reduce the rising cost of goods, look at how to minimize the effect on Nigerians. A lot of Nigerians spend most of their income on food. And so it lets us understand that even though we're removing the subsidy, BC, on petrol, there are 3 other subsidies that are important for the government and important for Nigerians, and those subsidies need to be consistently talked about. The first of these 3 subsidies is we're having a subsidy on the exchange rate. By the subsidy on the exchange rate, we need to take a decision, a very firm decision on, do we want to have variable multiple exchange rates, whereby some people get the dollars at a lower price and are able to, because of maladministration, are able to earn some profit on it. So the government needs to also understand that there's a subsidy on the exchange rate. The second subsidy is there's a need to have subsidy on production. Now, by subsidy on production, the government needs to be able to provide some farmers and provide, in fact, a lot of farmers subsidize agricultural imports. So yes, we're taking out subsidy on petroleum products, but the first is we need to review our subsidy on the exchange rate. We need to look at the subsidy on production. And the third and final subsidy is we need to look at how and what our decision will be when it comes to subsidizing credits. And that is, credits has been a major challenge for a lot of Nigerians. A lot of businesses, I don't know if you've ever been able to get, apart from what sometimes we're able to get, the salary advance, but there are millions of Nigerians that don't still have access to credit. So the government needs to focus on 3 things, as I mentioned: subsidizing, looking at the subsidy that is going on in our exchange rate, looking at effectively implementing subsidies on production, and looking at our subsidy on credit, which is making credit more affordable and available for millions of Nigerians. If we're able to manage these 3 subsidies, it will really reduce the effect of the removal of the subsidy on petroleum.
Well, now, let's still talk about the implications of all of these. Now, you talked about the use of vehicles, but it's not only vehicles that use petrol. Generators are there as well. And a lot of businesses actually depend on their generators to run their businesses. So what ripple effect, will this have?
So it depends. First of all, a lot of Nigerians spend money on fuel, generator, but the evidence we have today shows that majority of Nigeria's spending, 56% of Nigeria's spending, goes on food. The evidence from the National Bureau of Statistics gives us information about what percentage of your income, of your expenditure, goes on fuel and on light. And from that evidence, they say that about 6% of Nigerians' expenditure goes on these items. But perhaps let's take a look at another perspective, which is we've seen the changes in crude oil price. We've looked at inflation. To look at those that are arguing that what are the benefits or what are the challenges of the real challenges of we taking out the subsidy. And if we really focus on it, we'll realize that whenever a subsidy goes, there are benefits and there are challenges. And a poll that was conducted recently, and we asked Nigerians that should the subsidy stay or should the subsidy go? Because at the end of the day, it is Nigerians who are feeling the effect of it. The poll showed that majority of Nigerians, 53% of Nigerian samples said that the subsidy should go. 41% said the subsidy should stay. And about 6% said they didn't know. So even looking at what Nigerians really want, Nigerians want the subsidy to go based on a nationally representative poll that was conducted. And that is the fact. The second is, even though most Nigerians want the subsidy to go, it is to look at what are the effects of removing the subsidy, what are the merits and the demerits of the subsidy. And if we take a close look at that, there are three things that I'll classify as the beautiful things, the beauty of subsidy, and there are the three beasts of subsidy. The first beauty of subsidy is that if you look at it, what happens is whenever the subsidy, now that the subsidy has gone, it means that there's going to be more revenue to the government to invest in sectors such as health, such as agric, such as security. Another benefit is we're going to see less revenue losses to the government due to maladministration that often happens whenever the government is involved in business. So we're going to see less revenue losses. We're going to see more opportunities to be able to invest in critical sectors because now the government can use that money if they choose to proactively invest in other things. And as well, we're going to see, because it's now open, we're going to see more private sector competition. And whenever we see competition, one key thing happens, and it's called innovation. So the expectations, no guarantee, BC, but the expectation is that private sector participants will improve, will become more competitive, and then we'll see some innovation across the downstream sectors, especially across the filling stations, service standards, and the all. But even though we've talked about the benefits, some benefits, these three benefits to Nigerians, let's not hide the fact that there are some challenges that Nigerians will face based on this. And the first challenge is families, you and I, we're going to have to be thinking critically about how we spend money. And so some items that we would have bought without thinking twice, there's going to be a lot of second thinking before we buy some of those items. So some producers will see that demand for their products will increase, and that's because Nigerians are buying less of those items because they still need to go out and transportation is important. The second is we're going to see people depleting their savings because income isn't increasing and inflation is rising. And so we're going to see families taking out of their savings, individuals taking out of their savings as well to be able to meet their general daily needs. So there are challenges and the opportunities that the petrol price deregulation offers. But at the end of it all, let's not forget that it is all about the new reality. And the new reality is we need to be more effective and efficient as a nation with the decisions we make, especially on how we spend and allocate our money.
Now, let's talk about the petrol imports, of course, which the PPPRA or NNPC has approved for private marketers to engage in. Now, how possible can that be now that the full deregulation is here?
I think it's a good possibility. It's a good possibility. We've seen the PPRA talk about petrol price bans. The effect at the end of it all is we're trying to get to a position where, like every other household item Nigerians are being used to paying for, petrol becomes among those sort of commodities. So today, you buy tomatoes from the market at the price at which the market woman chooses to sell, but you could choose to buy your tomatoes at a higher price from a supermarket. You could choose to buy, there are different types of breads, there are different types of commodities. So what I see and what could likely happen is we'll be seeing different petrol grades. So we'll be seeing unleaded, we'll be seeing premium petrols, we'll see a lot of volatility in petrol prices, we'll see a lot of improvements in service standards, we'll see some sort of loyalty schemes, because now the space is open for people to think. What had happened before was because of the subsidy, a lot of investors were not thinking. and they were just playing on arbitrage opportunities, and they were milking the nation. Again, let's not forget there are benefits of the deregulation, and there are also challenges. What the government now needs to do is to understand the challenges and create policies to mitigate challenges that more than 100 million adults, Nigerians, and their families will face.
Now, what about the large private refineries now? When will they kick off, and, what impacts will it have on all of this?
Well, the challenge with large refineries is the large refineries private sector, but the question is how much will crude oil sell for in another 5 years? We are seeing electric vehicles coming in. So the large refineries also have to understand that this oil business, crude oil, refined crude oil, is perhaps a business that is declining. So the large refineries need to understand that whatever they are doing, it is likely going to be an investment to the short and medium term. Based on all global indicators, crude oil and crude oil proceeds are short to medium term investments. In the longer term, we'll be seeing less petrol-driven cars. We'll be seeing more electric-driven cars, and that trend will start from the United States, from Europe, from Asia. And the advantage the large refineries will have in Nigeria is it might take some time, perhaps 2 decades, before Nigerians really start getting into the groove of electric vehicles. So the large refineries might still be able to survive again in the short to medium term, but it's very unlikely that in the next 3 or 4 decades, it's very unlikely that your children and my children will drive petrol cars. Most likely, our children and grandchildren wouldn't really know petrol cars. They will know electric cars. And perhaps if Nigeria is also able to think of how we also can start getting involved in motor assemblies, assembly lines for these electric vehicles, and we see a lot of private investors trying to look at partnerships to be able to catch in when that trend comes in. All right,
Babajide, that would be a very good point to leave the conversation. Channels TV data analyst.
In the final analysis, it is always better to debate a question.
We have to take a break now.
The pleasure is all mine.
All right, Babajide Ogusowo, thanks for coming on the program. Our commodities market update will be up next in just a moment. Please stay with us.